Good evening. It's great to be with you all. Welcome to this 30th annual Paul Holmer Lecture in Christianity and the Humanities. My name is Andrew Hansen. I serve as Program Director at Anselm House, and I'm honored to welcome you to tonight's event. Some of you are joining us for the very first time for an Anselm House event. A very warm welcome to you. Anselm House is a center for Christian thought and formation that has been serving the University of Minnesota for over 40 years. Our mission is to connect faith and knowledge with all of life. We believe that the person of Jesus Christ transforms not only hearts, but also minds, and indeed whole persons. Because the search for truth is central to the Christian faith, Jesus says in the Gospel of John, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." We aim to partner with Minnesota's flagship research university in its search for truth about our world and about ourselves. And we pursue truth in community, a community that includes university students, faculty, and staff, as well as people from the wider Twin Cities. While our Christian commitments at Anselm House animate this pursuit, we welcome all seekers after truth to join us and participate in this community. As I mentioned, tonight's lecture is the 30th of these Holmer lectures. Begun in 1996, this annual lectureship explores what it might mean to think Christianly within the humanities. It's named in honor of the late Paul L. Holmer, a Christian philosopher and theologian who first taught here at the U before later moving to Yale. Over these 30 years, this series has brought distinguished Christian voices to the University of Minnesota, from historians like Mark Knoll and Carlos Eyre, to philosophers like Jean Bethke-Elshtain, Alvin Plantinga, and Megan O'Sullivan, to theologians like Stanley Hauerwas, Miroslav Volf, and Emmanuel Katangale. In my time at Anselm House, I've been present for nearly half of these lectures. And I've been impressed not only by the contributions of our Holmer lecturers, but also by the lively responses and discussions that they've generated among all of you, the community of Anselm House. I have good memories of receptions running late into the night after these lectures, when attendees have lingered to discuss ideas that were sparked by the evening's lectures. And towards that end, we're gonna host a reception tonight as well, so invite you to make plans to stick around and stay and enjoy the conversation. Tonight, Professor Frey will continue and extend this rich tradition of Christian thinking in the humanities. In a moment where STEM fields seem to hold all of the status and influence in the university, Professor Frey is a champion of the traditional liberal arts because she's seen the ways that liberal education can guide us into wisdom for living well. And the subject of her talk tonight, Flannery O'Connor, was not only one of America's great creative writers, but also, as we'll hear about tonight, a deeply reflective and theologically astute Catholic scholar. I've sometimes read O'Connor's essay, The Church and the Fiction Writer, with students in our Fellows program at Anselm House, so that they can see a careful mind at work, exploring the vocation of a Christian artist. Before we introduce Professor Frey further, I've got just a couple of quick housekeeping matters to be aware of tonight. So first, we are going to be giving away copies of Flannery O'Connor's complete stories as part of a book giveaway connected to the sign up for the Anselm House email list. So I think there's a QR code right up here. You can use that to fill out the form, register for the mailing list, and be eligible to win one of 3 copies tonight. And we'll announce at the end of the event tonight who those winners are. Second, we would love to get your thoughts and your feedback on the event tonight. I think there should be some response cards, some evaluations that got passed around. If you don't have one of those, just raise your hand and we can make sure to get that to you. But we would love to hear what you thought about tonight's event. You can drop those in baskets that are gonna be on the way out of the theater tonight. We are very grateful to be hosting tonight's lecture in partnership with the Department of Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas. We see ourselves at Anselm House as engaged in a similar kind of project to that of Catholic Studies. and we've benefited much from their friendship over these years. To say more about Catholic studies and to introduce tonight's speaker, I want to welcome to the podium Professor Erica Kidd. Dr. Kidd is Associate Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, a philosopher and a scholar of St. Augustine, and a longtime friend of Anselm House. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kidd.
We in Catholic Studies at St. Thomas are so excited to be co-sponsoring this lecture this evening. It's a real privilege for us. Catholic Studies at St. Thomas is an interdisciplinary project with two parts. We have a department that offers graduate and undergraduate degrees that people like you can take at any time. You're welcome. Can you not hear? You cannot hear? I'll lean in a little bit more. Okay, great. I'll lean in. So we offer graduate and undergraduate programs. We also have a center that offers enrichment opportunities and professional programs. So I encourage you to take a look if any of that is of interest. Around St. Thomas Catholic Studies, we like to say we are interested in everything, from Homer to Evelyn Waugh, from Giotto to Terrence Malick, from God to dirt. In St. Thomas Catholic Studies, we try to help our students see how everything is ordered and related in intelligible ways. And I should say the dirt part, that's not just a figure of speech. I actually worked with a student on a project on managed grazing for cattle. So everything, we're interested in everything. Our distinguished speaker this evening, Dr. Jennifer Frey, is interested in everything as well. I met Professor Frey in person for the first time a couple of years ago at a conference on hope in higher education. She was there representing the bright spot in higher education that she herself was building, the Honors College at the University of Tulsa, and her reputation preceded her. The first time, actually, that I had heard about Dr. Frey was when my husband texted me about an episode of her philosophy, theology, and literature podcast, Sacred and Profane Love. It was about the book Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. It was a really great episode. Her podcast, alongside her writing in First Things, Image, New York Times, The Point, The Wall Street Journal, all give ample evidence of Professor Frey's rich and capacious understanding of the Christian intellectual life. She moves easily from conversation with Cornel West on James Baldwin, to discussion of falling birth rates, to reflection on Walt Whitman and civic hope. Professor Frey has also published widely on virtue and moral psychology and has edited 3 academic volumes on virtue and human action: Self-Transcendence and Virtue, Perspectives from Philosophy, Psychology, and Theology, Practical Truth, and a forthcoming volume on practical wisdom. Professor Frey received her PhD in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh and is now professor of philosophy at the University of Tulsa. Frey is currently at work on a book on the ethics of Thomas Aquinas. And she's here to speak with us tonight about Flannery O'Connor, another woman who was pretty interested in everything, from peafowl to tattoos to the angelic doctor. Professor Frey's lecture this evening is titled Flannery O'Connor, Hillbilly Nihilist or Hillbilly Thomist. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Erica. Thanks to Anselm House for bringing me here to this pretty distinguished lecture series. When I heard some of the previous lectures, I got kind of nervous. Also, I just want to say, I am so impressed with Anselm House and everything that they do to elevate the university community and to call students to the pursuit of wisdom. So just really grateful for your ministry and your work. So I want to talk about Flannery as a hillbilly Thomist. Spoiler, she's a hillbilly Thomist. And sorry if you were on edge about that. And I'm basically dividing the talk into 3 parts. First, I just want to tell you about her because she had an amazing, a short but amazing life. And then I want to talk a little bit about her Thomism. And then I just want to do like a reading of a text to try to display what I'm saying as something that you might believe. So first, her life. So Mary Flannery O'Connor was born on March 25th, 1925 in Savannah, Georgia, right in the heart of the city's Irish Catholic enclave in a hospital run by the Sisters of Mercy. Mary was the precocious, intense, quirky, and artistically gifted only child to Regina and Edward O'Connor. Little Mary was painfully shy and antisocial, but apparently she enjoyed a rich interior life from a young age, which she brought to life in both artistic drawings and stories. As a young girl, she was educated by the strict and pious nuns at St. Vincent's Grammar School, but she was a bad student. She got bad grades and she didn't like school. She particularly abhorred traditional displays of piety and spoke disdainfully of nun-inspired doings. So she was not really in love with the nuns, apparently. In 1937, when she was only 12 years old, her father, with whom she was especially close, was diagnosed with lupus. At 13, her father moved the family to Milledgeville, way out in the country. Milledgeville was the site of her mother's family's stately antebellum mansion and her uncle's 550-acre dairy farm. Mary disdained the trappings of Southern girlhood that her mother had tried to impose upon her from a young age, and Milledgeville was kind of a nice respite from that, a kind of a place away from those pressures, but it was also just full of the good country people that would come to populate O'Connor's fiction. In 1941, when she was only 16, Mary's father succumbed to lupus, which was the end of her childhood. She described the loss in a way that I believe is an early and important clue to her later approach to art, and also the lens through which she understood her own Catholic faith. So this is a quote from her letters. "The reality of death has come upon us, and a consciousness of the power of God has broken our complacency like a bullet in the side. A sense of the dramatic, of the tragic, of the infinite has descended upon us, filling us with grief, but above grief, wonder." So in her father's early death, the person with whom she felt the deepest kinship and affection, she was able to see the work of divine grace in the world, but that grace was painful. Her insight that God's grace can be violent, dark, and disruptive, that it can shock one out of complacency and comfort in order to lead them to a deeper perception of reality through awe and wonder, this will become an enduring theme of her fiction. In high school, Mary began to stand out for her writing, and it wasn't always well received. Here is testimony from one of her classmates. "Being in creative writing class with Mary was sheer torture. I remember she wrote very strange stories with weird characters that no one could understand." In 1942, Mary began to study at the Georgia State College for Women, a progressive school right there in Milledgeville. One of the formative moments of her college years was a course that she took in philosophy. It was a survey of modern philosophers. The hero of the course was René Descartes, who saw the world as purely material and devoid of value or meaning. The perspective of the professor in the class was one of a secular humanist. Flannery was unimpressed with this perspective and took to arguing regularly with her professor, even going so far as to diagram the differences between Thomas Aquinas and modernism on the blackboard. By Mary's light, modernism had blinded people to the most central features of reality through its narrow focus on the material and the quantifiable, something that Weber might call disenchantment. For Mary, by contrast, nature was the site for grace. It was therefore both intrinsically meaningful and good. It was not just so much stuff for us to dominate and control however we might will. As much as they disagreed on matters of substance, her philosophy professor recognized her prodigious talents as a thinker and a writer, and he encouraged her to apply to graduate school at the University of Iowa. Now, O'Connor was accepted into the School of Journalism at Iowa, but immediately upon arriving, she decides that she has to meet the head of the newly formed Writers' Workshop, a man named Paul Engel. However, her rural Georgia accent was so thick that he could not understand a word she said. He eventually has to hand her a pad of paper on which she writes the following sentences. My name is Flannery O'Connor. I am not a journalist. May I come to the Writers' Workshop? Upon reading one of her stories that she submitted him, Engel accepts her immediately. Around this time, Mary began to sign all of her writings as Flannery O'Connor. Of the change of her name, she quipped, well, who is likely to buy the stories of an Irish washerwoman? It was certainly not lost on her that Flannery was a gender-neutral name, and she would sometimes brag that she received rejections from top journals addressed to Mr. Flannery O'Connor. Also around this time, O'Connor began to read the great European novelists voraciously, and she began to work very diligently on the formal aspects of her craft as a writer. She met many famous writers and poets who passed through the workshop to share their manuscripts. After her time in Iowa, she took up a quite prestigious summer writing residency at Yaddo, which is the famous artist colony in Sarasota Springs, New York. Robert Lowell, the poet, would later join her there, and he and Flannery became fast and very close friends. Lowell helped connect Flannery to prominent literary Catholics like Robert Giroux at Harcourt Brace and Robert and Sally Fitzgerald, who helped her once she moved to New York City to try to advance her career as a writer. Flannery hated New York, although her famous friends were happy to talk her up at cocktail parties in Manhattan. Flannery's temperament and Southern background made her especially ill-suited to thrive there. So after a very short time in New York City and an even shorter time living with the Fitzgeralds in Connecticut, Flannery has to return home to Milledgeville, and it will be her final return. And that's because she has been diagnosed with lupus, and she knew that she wouldn't have much time left. She also knew that her mother would have to take care of her. Upon her return to the southern countryside, Flannery devotes herself completely to writing, painting, and to the hundreds of birds on her farm, including about 70 peafowl. Her first novel, Wise Blood, was published in 1952 when she was 27 years old. Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea and Steinbeck's East of Eden were published that same year. Critical reactions to Flannery's novel were mixed. As was the case in high school, critics could not understand why her characters were so darkly comic and freakish, or why her works contained so much seemingly senseless violence. Her publisher remarked that they all recognized her power, but they missed her point. The publication of A Good Man is Hard to Find the following year secured her status as one of the greatest writers of her generation. Her publisher compared the story to the best of Hemingway and Melville. By the end of her short writing career, O'Connor published 2 novels and 32 short stories. She died on August 3rd, 1964, at the age of 39, while she was busy at work on finishing her 3rd novel. So that's her life. I now want to talk about her hillbilly Thomism. So the wonder that Flannery experienced at an early age at her father's death led her to study theology. She confessed to her friends in a letter that she had the habit of reading the 700-page modern library introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas before bed every evening. She claimed that she read a lot of theology because it makes her writing bolder. She was often described by critics as a hillbilly nihilist, but she complained this was false, and she wanted to create the true impression that she is, in fact, a hillbilly Thomist. So she is a hillbilly. This is pretty incredible to people, this claim that she's a hillbilly Thomist, because her fiction is so grotesque. Her stories are comic, but darkly so. They are tinged with violence, cruelty, and a level of freakishness that seems frankly too far afield from those virtues or stable perfections that Thomas Aquinas argued were necessary to know and love God and keep his commandments. Her characters are typically Protestant or atheist. They display obvious vices and engage in forms of religiosity that are mawkish and wild. What then is Thomist about her fiction? I think we might begin with her understanding of art as deeply Thomist. First, in that it aims at truth, but within the formal constraints of art as a habit. Artistic form and craft are a matter of technique that must be mastered, because the truth that art communicates will be essentially bound up within artistic form. We have no reason to praise a novel solely on the ground that it contains philosophical or theological knowledge, since our account of such knowledge is extrinsic to the form of the novel as a work of art. The key to understanding her Thomism about art is to be able to formulate the question, how does the novel contain truth in the mode of art or as a novel? We must do this to keep art and theory apart, as art is practical and theory is speculative. The artist is not a theologian or a philosopher, but a maker of artistic works that must be evaluated on those terms. The artist aims to write a great novel, but the novel will only be great if it communicates truth within the form of the novel. Someone who possesses an art, right, in the sense of a craft, has practical knowledge. She doesn't just have knowledge of facts about the world or theory, she knows how to realize the artistic form that's in her mind in some particular matter. And a great writer doesn't just have a great idea or a great concept. A great writer can produce great works of fiction, which means that she has good judgment in relation to the work she can produce. But of course, a good judgment is always a true judgment, but truth again is here practical in relation to the work made and manifest in it. So a novel doesn't simply contain truths that could be articulated outside the novel. A summary of the truths one might discover by reading Madame Bovary, such as that a bad education can lead to a bad life, and that adultery is no way to find love, would be no substitute for reading Flaubert. Because the truths are only communicated through the art according to its own proper mode, right? It's only in experiencing the story of Emma Bovary where we see the dramatic action of the story, right? The truths are embedded in that dramatic action. The moral philosopher might convey the same truths, but in a different manner and in a different mode, in a way that has different effects. So while art includes technique, great literary art requires more than mere technique. I think anybody who's read a trashy novel knows the difference. The great artist must also develop the habits of contemplation that are necessary to develop a vision of reality that informs the technique and suffuses it. Such a vision cannot be communicated in a writing class. It is only the product of study and the cultivation of the mind, or as O'Connor puts it in her own writing, the artist's whole intellectual life. O'Connor argues that the dramatic judgments of the fiction writer are informed by her broader contemplative vision of reality, most especially of her vision of the human person and its relation to what she would call creation. So the content of what she writes reflects her vision of the way things are, which means that the cultivation of the artist includes the cultivation of a vision that is broad, deep, and truthful to reality. There is no other way for the novelist to deliver what O'Connor says she ought. And this is a quote from her. "Within the form of the book, a total experience of human nature at any one place and time." So the great artist must have vision in the sense that she's able to communicate this vision through her art. This truthful vision is in some sense external to her art, but it must inform it, perhaps in a way that is analogous to how grace illumines the intellect in the virtue of faith. Art, then, is diametrically opposed to fantasy and unreality. So the truthful vision that animates her fiction, she does get from Aquinas, not only from him, but she did read him habitually every evening beginning in high school. Now, according to Aquinas' vision of man, we are created in the image of God and naturally ordered to our own perfection or happiness through the use of our rational capacities. But our work during our pilgrimage on earth is to freely cooperate with God's grace so that we can attain a supernatural and beatifying end. Only that supernatural and beatifying end will fully complete or perfect us. We are fallen through sin. We need grace to see the world as it really is, and we need grace to be capable of loving and knowing God as he is in himself. Can't do that on our own. This grace is totally unmerited. God loves us and calls us to himself, even as we are busy rejecting him and distracting ourselves with lesser goods. She also takes from Aquinas what she calls his Christian realism. For Thomas, what it means to live well as a human person, a rational creature, is to know and love reality. So to seek and conform oneself to what is true so that one can have loving communion with what is good and take one's delight in what is beautiful. The true, the good, and the beautiful are, for Thomas, just different ways a person can be related to being itself, or reality. And of course, God is the ultimate reality. His essence is his existence, which means that God just is truth, beauty, and goodness in its fullness or plenitude. And human perfection is found in communion with him. Reality includes both God's creation as communicative of and ordered to his own goodness, and God's activity in sustaining creation in its being and working to bring it back to himself. The Christian, therefore, can never try to hide from reality, but always to live in conformity with him. This turns out to be really hard for us. Reality can be a tough master, and O'Connor clearly realizes this. To live and persist in sin is simply to prefer our own fantasies to what is real and enduring. And O'Connor sees that the temptation to resist, ignore, or distract oneself from reality is constant. It is central to her vision of grace that it works to pierce the veil of perception, to help us to see the world as it really is, and to force us to confront reality, most especially the unpleasant reality of the effects of sin in our own souls. O'Connor thinks that sin is real, and sin is fundamentally a rupture between man and God. That rupture can only be healed through grace, which heals, elevates, and perfects nature. The idea that God's grace is what can help us live in reality, including the reality of the incarnation as our redemption and salvation, is, I believe, the enduring theme of her fiction. She once wrote that she was always irritated by people who imply that writing fiction is an escape from reality. No, It is a plunge into the reality, and it is deeply shocking to the system. Flannery thought her readers were coarsened, and that it would take some pretty drastic measures to get them to see the truth. As a Catholic writer whose audience was largely secular, she felt she needed to shock her reader. This was quite strategic on her part. She said, to the hard of hearing, you have to shout. And for the almost blind, you must draw large and startling figures. So that explains some of the freakishness. O'Connor further insists that morality for an artist, again, lies in that vision that he can communicate, not in a lesson, theological or moral. So she doesn't think that great literature is meant to be didactic. She says that if the writer is a successful artist, his moral judgment will be the same as his dramatic judgment. It will be inseparable from the very act of seeing. So again, it's in the drama of the story. The vision comes out. Finally, for O'Connor, there is a deeply incarnational aspect of art. The spiritual is materially realized. The truth of fiction is not and cannot be given in abstract principles, but in the experiential context of the material of a particular story. In the incarnation, divine spirit becomes emmattered in human flesh. Likewise, in fiction, sacred truths become emmattered in the specific characters and circumstances and materials of the profane story. Vision is of the perceptual realm, as St. Thomas teaches. It will always pertain to particulars. That is why a moral vision can never be fully captured in philosophy or theology. That's necessarily abstract and universal. A true moral vision requires art, and most especially literature and storytelling. I think it's no accident that sacred scripture is full of stories, poems, and parables, and very little theology. Fundamentally, Flannery's fiction points us to the need for redemption. The key to understanding her fiction is a combination of grasping the sacramental nature of the imagery she is using and the dramatic action of grace in her stories. A bull that gores a woman trying to kill it is an image of divine charity. A missing leg is a symbol of pride and the need for humility. A tattoo is an icon, and a terminal illness the means of new life. But what Flannery never wanted us to lose sight of is the price of redemption or restoration, which is evil and sin. People thought she was a hillbilly nihilist because her characters are freaks and misfits caught in self-destructive patterns that are difficult to understand. But what her critics missed was her theological vision, which has it that sin is real. Its consequences are deadly, though often comically so, and that grace is necessary for us to see the world and be free. This is the essence of her hillbilly Thomism, the need for the life of grace in which all will be glorified, renewed, and redeemed in the wise blood that flows from the redemptive act on the cross. Okay, so I've made a bunch of claims. They're all pretty abstract, and I just said that's not how we engage in literary art. So I'd like to analyze a story to try to make my case, and I decided to pick the one that made her very famous and that you are most likely to know, which is A Good Man is Hard to Find. This is a story of God's grace extended to someone outside the sacraments, its usual vehicle, in order to effect a profound change in the characters. It is a darkly comic story of mishaps, misfits, violence, and merciful redemption, and it does have a hillbilly nihilist in it. So we're introduced to a family. They're preparing to embark on a road trip. A genteel grandmother, Bailey, her son, his wife, and their 3 kids. And they're headed to Florida. But the grandmother is needling Bailey to go to Tennessee instead. She starts to make her case against Florida by pointing out that, and this is a quote, there's this fellow that calls himself the misfit, is loose from the federal pen and headed towards Florida. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that a loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did it. This is a scene that sets up the central irony of the story. because of course it will be the grandmother who leads the family straight to the misfit out of her own stupidity and pride. The grandmother pretends she wants to be at home, but everyone, especially the grandchildren, know that that is false. And sure enough, the next morning, the grandmother is the first person dressed and ready to go. She has snuck her cat into her big black suitcase, even though her son has expressly forbidden this. The grandmother is described as dressed to the nines so that in case of a car accident where she dies, anyone seeing her dead body on the highway would know that she was a real lady. Now, along the way, the grandmother gets it into her head that they're close to a plantation she used to visit as a child. And the more she reminisced about it, the stronger was her desire to see it. She began to tell the children of a secret panel in the house where the family hid their silver from Sherman and his troops during the Civil War, a feature that she sure wished were true as it excited the children, but it was totally made up. She convinces Bailey to travel down this dirt road, which she believes leads to the plantation. But along the road, a horrible thought comes to her that is so upsetting that she knocks over her suitcase. The cat leaps out of it and attacks Bailey, who subsequently wrecks the car. The grandmother's horrible thought was that the plantation she so vividly recalled was not in Georgia at all, but East Tennessee. The car is now inoperable, and many people are injured. In a few minutes, a car comes along the road, and the grandmother flags it down. There are 3 men inside. The driver looks down with a steady, expressionless gaze. He is shirtless, wearing spectacles, and ill-fitting and mismatched clothes. The grandmother immediately identifies him. "You're the misfit. I recognized you at once." "Yes'm," the man says, smiling. "But it would have been better for all you, lady, if you hadn't recognized me." In this moment, we know for certain that the grandmother has now sealed their doom. But the grandmother attempts to appeal to his sense of Southern propriety. "You wouldn't shoot a lady, would you?" the grandmother asks. "I would hate to have to," the misfit replies. She keeps telling the misfit that he's a good man, where this means he doesn't have common blood. She assures him repeatedly that she knows he must come from nice people and asks him comically, wouldn't he prefer to settle down and live a nice, comfortable life with a nice woman? The entire scene is darkly comic. One can't help but be amused by the grandmother's behavior, even as one is utterly horrified by the reality of the situation unfolding. And the misfit is well-mannered. Even as he is clearly the angel of death come to take them, he's respectful about it. He even chastises Bailey for swearing at his mother, but in a gentle and patient way. Bailey is taken to the woods along with his young son to be shot by the misfit's men. Upon his disappearance, the grandmother asks the misfit if he ever prays, and she assures him that Jesus would help him if he did. But the misfit replies, "I don't want no help. I'm doing just fine by myself." The misfit explains to the grandmother that he calls himself the misfit because "I can't make what all I done wrong fit what all I gone through in punishment." And he asks her, "Does it seem right to you, lady, that one is punished a heap and another ain't punished at all?" To his theological query about guilt and retribution, the grandmother continues to insist that he shouldn't shoot a lady and that he comes from nice people. And for good measure, she adds that she'll give him all the money he has, all she has, if he will spare her life. She hears 2 more gunshots coming from the woods. At this point, the misfit looks her squarely in the eye and says the following, and now I'll just read from the text because it's so amazing. "Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead," the misfit continued, "and he shouldn't have done it. He'd thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw everything away and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can, by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness," he said, and his voice had become almost a snarl. "Maybe he didn't raise the dead," the old lady mumbled. not knowing what she was saying and feeling so dizzy that she sank down in the ditch with her legs twisted under her. I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't, the misfit said. I wished I had been there, he said, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I'd have been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice, if I'd have been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for just an instant. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own, as if he was going to cry, and she murmured, Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reached out and touched him on the shoulder. The misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him and shot her 3 times in the chest. Then he put his gun down on the ground and took off his glasses and began to clean them. Hiram and Bobby Lee returned from the woods and stood over the ditch, looking down at the grandmother who half sat and half lay in a puddle of blood with her legs crossed under her, like a child, and her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. Without his glasses, the misfit's eyes were red-rimmed and pale and defenseless-looking. Take her off and throw her where you've thrown the others, he said, picking up the cat that was rubbing against his leg. She's a talker, weren't she? Bobby Lee said, sliding down the ditch with a yodel. She would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if there had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. Some fun, Bobby Lee said. Shut up, Bobby Lee, the misfit said. It's no real pleasure in life. That's the end of the story. Now, in one sense, the story ends exactly as we've known it would. The grandmother's murdered by the misfit on account of her own lack of good sense. But what we didn't expect, and what the misfit clearly didn't expect, was for the misfit to make himself vulnerable to her, to express his own desire for faith and his despair in the fact of its absence, and what the lack of that faith has done to him. And in that moment of vulnerability, for the grandmother to see him as one of her own children, to recognize his wounded humanity and to respond with the tenderness of a mother's love, which is both totally unmerited and totally necessary. And that revelation, that moment of seeing him in his reality as a child of God, just like one of her own, and responding appropriately, makes him lash out in violence. He feels attacked by this expression of charity towards him and kills her. But in this moment, the moment of her death, the grandmother is utterly transformed by God's grace. She has died with a smile on her face and the posture of an innocent child. The misfit has, in this moment, become an unwitting instrument of God's action in the world, redeeming the grandmother in spite of himself. And just as the grandmother has seen the misfit for the first time for who he really is, likewise, he takes off his glasses, and his eyes, too, have changed. They are no longer steady and expressionless and intent on murder, but red-rimmed and pale and defenseless. He, too, has been changed by this encounter. And as he cleans the grandmother's blood from his glasses, we are meant to wonder the extent to which he too sees things differently now, and perhaps more clearly. We are led to wonder whether her blood is the first step to his own redemption. And so then it is no surprise that he expresses disgust that one of his men would take pleasure in the murderous afternoon. It's no real pleasure in life, he chastises them, backing away from the nihilism he had just professed. Here we see a vision of grace that displays the power of God to work change in us in spite of our sins and our dispositions to sin, that God's love has the power to break us out of our complacency. In the grandmother's case, her false self-image as a Southern lady, which narrows her vision of herself and other people as they fit within the class structure of an old South she longs to bring back. And in the misfit's case, his false image of himself as radically cut off from God's love and providential care, as someone whose main goal is to escape the structures of judgment and punishment in order to live freely, to pursue the pleasures of meanness. In the final moments of the story, the action of grace does give us a sense of the dramatic, the tragic, and the infinite. It does fill us with grief, but above grief, wonder, at the goodness of God and his infinite love and mercy for human beings. In all of Flannery's stories, there are moments of profound change, moments of grace at work in the world. That grace is not always accepted, but it is offered. And grace often works to clarify the vision of her characters. It works to pierce the veil of self-deception in people who are humorously ignorant of their own defects of soul, making those defects manifest to them in quite extraordinary ways. It is this manifestation that is necessary for any hope of change. I want to give the last words to Flannery. She wrote, "I'm mighty tired of reading reviews that call a good man brutal and sarcastic. My stories are hard, but they are hard because there is nothing harder or less sentimental than Christian realism. The truth is, my stories have been watered and fed by dogma. I am a Catholic, and at some point in my life, I realized that not only was I a Catholic, but this was all I was. That I was a Catholic not like somebody else would be a Baptist or a Methodist, but like somebody else would be an atheist. If my stories are complete, it is because I see everything as beginning with sin, taking in the redemption, and reckoning on a final judgment." Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think as that last quote brought out, and as your talk and the reading brought out, like her work is not easy in any way. It's very challenging, it's very difficult, and so it's so helpful to have somebody walk with us through that and sort of model how do you begin to get this vision of reality that she gives us. So thank you for leading us into that tonight. Sure. We are going to turn this into a conversation now and have time for your questions for Professor Frey. We've got 2 microphones here, kind of at the front of each row. So if you want to bring your question, come line up at the microphone here. We can kind of alternate between those 2 microphones for questions. And as you are kind of mulling over your questions, coming down and lining up, I wanted to say just a couple of things about the ways that we try to have these dialogues, these conversations at Anselm House. So sometimes we talk about the intellectual virtues. These are sort of habits of mind that help the learning process go well, that help us seek truth faithfully. I want to offer something similar tonight, maybe 3 practices that I think can help this conversation lead us into truth well in this context. I'm not going to claim these necessarily as intellectual virtues across all contexts. I think some of them are, but one of them, in fact, I'm aware that Aquinas would actually identify as a vice, and I know that Jennifer would love to say more about that, so feel free to ask about that if you want to. But they all start with C, and that's the reason I kept this one, even though it's a vice. I'm gonna say curiosity, yes. They all start with C, so they're easy to remember. So the first one, be curious. Come with a posture of wanting to learn something, to seek further after truth. So don't just sort of have a comment or an opinion that you want to share, but really bring a question, something that you're wanting to know more about. Second one, be charitable. We want to give one another the benefit of the doubt in our disagreement, so feel very free to disagree with one another. Feel free to disagree with Professor Frey. But we want to have charity that we're assuming the best of the other, that there, even in that disagreement, the other person may have something for us to learn from. And the third one, be concise. Again, concision is not always, I think, a virtue, but in this context, I think as we are concise, we make room for more questions, for more participation. So I think these are 3 practices that if we practice them together can help us better seek the truth tonight. So I am not seeing anyone lined up at the microphone. Oh, here we go. Perfect. Here everybody comes. Now, I do want to say I want to prioritize any student questions. So if anybody's a student that has a question, you can jump to the front of the line here.
I'm a faculty member.
Oh, well, we'll go to faculty next. But the university really should be, for students first and foremost. So if there are any student questions, please feel free to kind of jump the line and come on up. But let's take actually a faculty question first, and then we'll, yes, Jamie, come on.
Okay.
come on down, and then we'll move on.
Now I'm embarrassed. Oh gosh. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was such a really thoughtful presentation. I'm a bioethicist who also is a Jane Austen scholar, so one, we should talk. But I also grew up in a tradition that was very focused on Christian purity and pursuing this kind of faithful life, which was seen as only viewing or engaging with Christian media, Christian authors, right, Christian bookstores. So I want to ask you a little bit, like Flannery has so much profanity in like the baseness of humanity in her novels. And engaging with her when you come from this Christian purity tradition can be really hard. So how do we resist that temptation to be obsessed with purity and engage in these profane spaces to find God's truth there?
Yeah, what a great question, because honestly, like, my experience is that secular people love Flannery more than Catholics do. Like, my mother-in-law, God love her, was like, "Oh, you really like Flannery? I'll read it." And she was like, "What the hell is this?" That was like, what did I do? And yeah. So it's and there are, I picked an easy story, but sometimes I have to walk away from Flannery. It's like too much. Like the violent buried away is a lot. But it's also such a beautiful novel, and I think that ability to find beauty and grace in the muck is really what is so compelling about her, because surely that's what God does. And but I do think that it is quite profane, right? I have a whole podcast called Sacred and Profane Love. I think that the sacred and profane, are constantly intermixed. And in Flannery especially. I don't know how to get beyond. I mean, okay, so somebody who's really famous and that I really respect, both as a writer and as a thinker, is Marilyn Robinson, and she hates Flannery, and she's written about how much she hates Flannery, but she doesn't understand Flannery. And I guess I want to say, like, you don't have to like Flannery O'Connor. Like, it's okay if you don't. But I do think that if you're going to dismiss her, you at least need to understand her. And I think so many of her admirers and her critics just frankly don't understand what she's doing. Because they're not picking up on the sacramental nature of the imagery. It's consistent, it's there, it makes sense, it's part of the story. You gotta know what the sun is doing. It's doing a lot of work. You gotta know what the woods and the tree line mean and things like this. But you also need to understand that the action of grace is often dark and disruptive and violent because there's no other way to reach these people. They are that far down in the muck. So, and I also think it goes back to the fact that, when she wrote a few essays about being a Catholic writer, being a Catholic Southern writer. And what she says is, like, look, I can't write like Dante. Dante could write like Dante because he lived in Christendom, and that's great. I don't live in Christendom. I live in the Christ-haunted South, right? And I have to write about that. And I have to write to readers. I have to write for people who read The New Yorker, who hate Southerners and also don't think very kindly of Christians. Like, how do I reach them? And she thought, well, she had to be she had to reach them through indirection, but also in a way that was like going to shock them. So it was very strategic on her part, and I recognize that it's not always pleasant, but it's not always pleasant in any one chunk. Like the murder baptism and the violent buried away is pretty rough going, only to be outmatched by what comes later. You think you've hit bottom, and then you don't know. But when you look at the novel as a whole, it's so beautiful. it's such a beautiful vision. So I don't know what to say. I mean, I love her. But it's also true that when I first read her, I was like, what the hell is going on? And there was a friar from Georgia who set me straight on Flannery, who has a bluegrass band called the Hillbilly Thomist. So, but like once you kind of see what she's doing, you can't unsee it. Yeah. She's hard. She's a tough writer.
I saw several questions that I may
Yeah,
have,
there are a
may
bunch
have
of people.
scared away
Come
by
back.
trying to prioritize.
Come back.
Yeah,
Thank-
feel free to just line up here
Yeah.
in order.
Thanks, Dr. Frey. Really appreciate all that you gave us to chew on tonight. And you may have already alluded to the answer to this in what you just said, but any sense of what you think Flannery wanted us to kind of sit with in kind of Tar Water's conversion at the end, his kind of prophetic moment there? Yeah, any idea of what you think she wants us to kind of sit with at the end of that novel?
I mean, I think it's the same thing that she's getting at, really, in all of her fiction. In a way, she keeps writing the same story again and again and again, because it's like the human story, right? But the strange thing is that he had to go through that hell to be redeemed, right? And I think, she has written, I love her essays. I love Flannery's essays. But she writes about the fact that she says something to the effect that, people think that Christianity should be comforting, and they forget that Christianity is the cross, right? And that when she, blood is a huge, blood, water, these are huge images in her fiction. And these are for her sacramental realities, right? Baptism on the one hand, Eucharist on the other. And when she talks about wise blood, right, she's talking about Christ. But what was the price? Like, what was the cost of that blood, right, shed for us? And again, she just doesn't think that grace is an electric blanket, right? She thinks it's the cross. She thinks that this is part of her Thomism. She thinks that the Christian life is demanding, right? That loving God, in some sense, it's hard for us. It's actually hard for us to love God because of sin, and we need that grace. But sin we can be, as it were, so lost that we kind of have to go through these really shocking, kinds of. I hesitate to say cruelty because I don't think God is being cruel to people. Grace is a kind of medicine that people need, but it's sometimes very painful. And I really think, and this is why I think, to some extent, like all great writers just like can't keep themselves out of their fiction because it's just an extension of who they are and their vision of the world. But I think we really have to go back to how much Flannery suffered. Flannery suffered a great deal. In most of her life, she was in extraordinary pain every day. She could really only write a few hours a day because the rest of the day she was in too much pain to do it. And she has a story called The Enduring Chill about a writer with an illness. And I think she's writing about herself. And that's also a very interesting story where someone is going through so many different forms of suffering, not just physical, but emotional, sufferings of alienation and feelings of failure and frustration and the whole thing. But at the end of the day, the Holy Ghost literally comes down to get him. And it's a shocking and beautiful image that she gives us at the end of that story. And she did say, I write happy stories. Well, they don't feel that way, right? But that guy, the Holy Ghost was coming to get him at the end of that story, right? And I think what's so interesting about Flannery's fiction is that every story is about the Holy Ghost trying to grab you. But like, people don't want to be grabbed. So he has to do some interesting things, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's what he had to go to be redeemed. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Frey, for a rich and insightful speech tonight for us. You kind of alluded to this a little bit in your comment about Flannery O'Connor's own biography, her life, how it informed her writing. Are there any, she has so much quirkiness and violence in her stories that are really out there. Is there anything specific in her own life experience that might have inspired those specific images, or they just, as you also alluded, just come from the truth of her artistic imagination?
Yeah, she's living in an interesting time intellectually. And so she has, of course, lots of biblical imagery, lots of sacramental imagery from the church, but she's also like super into Jung, you know? So there's like a lot of that in there. There was some Dominican priest that like was feeding her all this Jungian stuff. And she was really into Teilhard de Chardin. So there's some of that imagery or metaphor. Yeah, so it's kind of like, so there are lots of dreams in her stories, not in every story, but in lots of her stories, it's just like a super weird dream sequence. Turns out like Jung is the only way you could understand what's going on there. You know, but something I haven't stressed is that she's so funny. Her stories are really funny. When she was in college, she was like, what do you call the person who writes like the funnies in the newspaper? The comic. She was the comic, right? And she had this, and if you read her letters, it really comes out this like really biting, sarcastic wit that she has. And so she's also like really funny. I mean, some of this stuff is really funny. And I think that kind of dark comic perspective, a lot of that's just her personality. It's just her personality. She did suffer a lot, you know? And so even her humor is inflected with a certain kind of darkness, and that reflects her life. But I think what is so profound about her as a person and her as a writer is that all of her suffering only deepened her faith. And she really saw it as a gift. She saw it as a grace.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I brought the book, and I just was so moved by that point that where his face was twisted close to her own, as if he were going to cry. It just reminded me of the icon of the Madonna and the Child, right? So just so beautiful and grace-filled, that whole image, and I've never seen that. I've read the story so many times.
Yeah.
I also loved your point about without his glasses, he took us, and that there's blood on the glasses, bringing up your point earlier about kind of the dispelling or baptizing even of fantasy, and how reality then, by taking off the glasses, he can finally see. So
Yeah, whenever there's blood in Flannery's fiction, it's some kind of sanctification.
yeah. So my question is actually a little different. I would say I love a story that I will call The Artificial Negro.
Yes.
However,
yes.
the title is so difficult these days,
Yeah.
yet the theological impact to me personally was, I would even call it a conversion experience from the ending of that story. My question to you is, how do we quote it? How do you talk about that? That's a toughie. So just would be totally curious about how you deal with that.
Yeah, so that is a tough question. But I can just tell you that my practice is to remind people that works of art are time-bound, culture-bound, and that Flannery's artistic decisions were always in service of realism. So this was something that people brought up to Flannery, like when she would go up north and talk to those Yankees, and they would complain. And she would say, this is the way Southerners talk. Look, I write about Southerners, you know, and this is how they talk. And, you know, I mean, just like the English of so many of her characters is completely broken and bizarre, and only if you've heard a rural Georgia accent would you even have a grip on it. It's like, why is it hep and not help? I don't know. They didn't like L's. But like similarly, you know, that's what they call black people. And so I think it's just really important for people to understand that language evolves as morals evolve, as cultures evolve, but it's just not that interesting to go back in time and point out why everybody's like politically incorrect or whatever, because they just didn't have those standards. And you know, and Flannery's great-grandfather was this Confederate general. Flannery grew up in the Deep South, in the Jim Crow South. That these are things that we cannot get around. Flannery herself supported civil rights. I would never call her progressive. I think that's insane, but she supported civil rights. She is very harsh. She is sometimes harsh on her characters. And the characters she's most harsh about are those characters who pine for the Old South. She does not, she thinks that's fantasy. She thinks that's bad, right? But it's just a fact that these are her characters, this is the world that she's writing about. And so I don't personally like change the language or anything. I just tell people, I mean, I also don't like say the word in class because why would I do that? I'm not gonna do that, but at the same time, like if I'm writing about it, I'm gonna write about it. Yep. So I think it's tricky, it's hard to navigate, but I personally don't see any value in going back in time and pointing out how superior we are to people who came before us. I mean, it's cheap, it's easy, what's the point? Yeah.
So my philosophy professors love to emphasize Thomas Aquinas as like the original medieval synthesis of faith and reason. And so I'm wondering, like, where, if at all, do you see like a synthesis of faith and reason in Flannery O'Connor's works?
Yeah, so love that. I think it's not true that Aquinas was the original synthesis. I think it's older than him, but I do think it's probably perfected in him. But yeah, faith and reason. I think that for Flannery, that's a hard question. Because Flannery's characters are not like really very rational people that we're dealing with. Like, she doesn't write about professors or scholars or like people whose lives even make sense. So that's why I'm struggling here. I mean, she does write, she has a totally wonderful story about this young woman who's, you know, gone off to college and done some fancy book learning and has come back completely obnoxious. And you know, and she's quite literally humiliated, right? And this is a grace for her. Her humiliation is a necessary grace for her. So I think that story is probably the best example of how reason on its own can go completely haywire, right? Because she goes to college and just becomes like a fool by studying philosophy, which can definitely happen to people. Philosophy is best understood as a preparation for theology. So I think that's probably the best example. I think she's exploring that. And I think she's trying to show that, reason has like very clear, definite limits and needs revelation. Yeah.
Could you remind us of the title of that story, please?
Wasn't that on Good Country People?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, it's so good.
So I'm curious about the idea of synthesis that has been brought up. You laid a wonderful groundwork of the synthesis of the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Yeah.
You can't imagine the good without the true and the true without the good.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you can imagine the beautiful
Yeah.
without the true or the good. I'm thinking of Roger Scruton writes about this a little
Yes,
bit.
he does.
Now, I can see the synthesis in Flannery O'Connor, but I'm wondering about your theory as well. There's a lot of great literature that's beautiful that does not necessarily lead us to the truth unless you extract all of the things that aren't, and then you have this little substratum. So how do you put those things together, maybe outside of Flannery O'Connor, and reconcile it with your love for her synthesis?
Yeah, okay, wow, that's a hard question. Thank you. So, there's like scholarly debates about whether Thomas even thinks that beauties are transcendental. I'll put my cards on the table. I think beauties are transcendental, which means that, so the transcendentals, which are truth, oneness, goodness, and beauty, are just different ways that we are related to our experience being, right? So like one reality is true because it exists, it's a reality. It's also, so Thomas is just committed to it following from that fact that it also has to be in some sense good, because existence itself is good, so it can't be totally bad. And that it has unity, like that it is a reality, and that it's also in some sense beautiful. And it's beautiful to the degree that it has reality. Now, this theory is going to run into like some obvious problems, namely that some things are just like ugly, and they exist. And, like a really committed Thomist is going to be like, they're really going to nuance that, because Thomas does have a pretty formal account of beauty, as clarity and proportion and things like this, but it still involves like attraction, sensual attraction actually, because it has to involve the senses. And so, I don't know if like I just want to defend all of this now, because it's quite complicated. I think it's difficult to defend. However, my inclination is always to defend Thomas, though. Like probably I would defend it at the end of the day. But somebody like Scruton, I love Scruton. He's great, but he's not a Thomist, right? He's a Hegelian of some kind. And he has a very 19th century account of beauty, according to which we just have separate categories. And there's just this different category called the aesthetic. And it's just like not related to the other things. I don't love that view, but I understand that view because it just doesn't run into all these problems that the Thomist view runs into, right? I mean, you could just say, well, it's just separate. It doesn't have to be any of those other things. It's just a totally different thing. And so it's much easier to deal with like sea creatures that are terrifying looking, that definitely exist, and are in some sense good, but how are they beautiful? I don't know. And, you know, a Thomist is going to say, well, formally speaking, right, it's got some proportionality or whatever. I don't know. I don't know. It's tough. It's tough. And Flannery is much more insistent that art is about truth than beauty. She doesn't talk about beauty that much. It's interesting. I mean, like I said, my inclinations are that they're deeply connected, but you do run into some hard cases there. Yeah. And Scruton isn't going to have that problem. But he'll have other problems. So, you know, every theory has its own beautiful problems. So, I don't know who's next. Okay.
Thank you. I'm wondering, for people in the audience who are maybe new to Flannery O'Connor, is there a particular short story or one of her novels that you would recommend for those among the audience who are novices?
Yeah.
Maybe not The
for her
Violent Bear It
novels,
Away.
I would recommend The Violent Bear It Away, even though it's basically devastating, but it's so good. I don't know. I couldn't put it down. And it's just less weird than Wise Blood. Wise Blood is really weird. And in terms of short stories, I think Revelation is so good. It's so good, and I think it's pretty clear, like, what's going on there. But I also say with Flannery's stories, you need to read them at least 3 times. Because you read it once, and you're like, okay, that's the story. And then you read it twice, and you're like, oh. Wow. And then you read it the 3rd time and you like want to write a paper. So, yeah. There's so much there. Oh, sorry. There's so much there. But like you just don't see it until you go back. Because what you do is you see the story and you're like, yeah, okay, I get that. And then you go back and then you see like, oh my gosh, this is totally setting that up. And wow, this definitely means that now. So, Revelation. And reread it. Yeah.
Let's jump over to this side and then we'll go back.
Okay. So you've talked about how art is conveying truth, but that's not really, on a certain level, it's conveying truth, but within a form.
Yeah.
The given form.
Yeah.
And so in Flannery's writing, she's like going for kind of showing kind of truth in a kind of grotesque, hit you over the head with a blunt object way. But at the same time, it's also obscure, and so like as you've mentioned, like her fans and her critics are like don't understand what she's doing,
Yes.
and yet she like self-professedly said that she's doing it so that like kind of as a way to like
Shock
shout
people.
at a deaf audience. So if the audience doesn't understand what she's doing, how effective is it as a literary technique?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, she might have failed on her own terms. That's a good and difficult question. But it's so good when you do get it. I don't know. 'Cause, I mean, so look, I think there are some writers that just demand so much of their reader, right? And some writers are less demanding, like, and they're still great writers. Like Flaubert, I don't actually think is that demanding on his reader, and it's like amazing. But then, you know, David Foster Wallace is pretty demanding on his reader. And I don't personally have a view of like how to weigh that, you know? I mean, I think Thomas Aquinas is pretty demanding on his reader. Like, most students are like, this is boring as hell, and I don't know what he's talking about, you know? And like, why can't he be normal? And, but he's like the best. So I don't know how to weigh these things except to say that she's quite demanding. I think you read it once and you're just gonna miss a lot. You might be totally befuddled. But it's really worth, I would say that the payoff is worth the work that you have to put into it. But I don't know that she had any expectation that that it would be obvious. She doesn't talk about it that much. But it's a fair question. It's a fair question. Like, was it a bad strategy? I don't know, but it just created amazing art. It's just amazing. And I truly believe in 200 years people will still be reading it. Yeah.
I have two kind of interrelated questions. My first is more theoretical. When does the incongruity in art kind of become obscene? Like, where does it cross that line? And then the second would be, how would you think that Flannery O'Connor would encounter a culture like ours, which has embraced irony and nihilism as basically our kind of run-of-the-mill conversation? Like, would her strategy 100 years ago work today?
Yeah. Yeah. By obscene, do you mean like in the impious sense of?
Yeah, or even just increasing amounts of violence.
Yeah, so let me take the second one, because the first one's really hard and I don't know what to say. So the second one, I don't know if there could be like another Flannery. She seems kind of sui generis. And it's kind of interesting. There are a lot of conversations about the future of fiction, but most of them are like, no one's reading anymore. So like, who are we even writing fiction for, right? Like what, but certainly one might be quite worried about writing demanding fiction now because no one has the capacity to do anything with that. And then it's going to depend on whether you think fiction like kind of needs to have an audience. Flannery thinks it does, right? I think Flannery thinks that a work of art with no audience is a dead letter. You know, why would you do that? I tend to agree with her that the fiction writer needs to know his audience. So I think there are lots of difficult questions about what would work now, and I'm really glad I'm not a fiction writer. But it's not better for philosophy, but it was never good for philosophy, so it's fine. But then the part about when does it border on the obscene? That is such a good question. To me, when I hear obscene, I think about impiety, right? I don't think that she's impious. So I don't think whatever that line is, she crosses it. But some of this stuff is pretty outrageous, you know? So I don't know that I can like clearly defend what I'm saying, except that for me to say that it's impious just seems wrong. And so I'm not inclined to say it. But I don't know what that line is. It's a good question. It's a hard question. I just don't know.
Sure. I think we probably got time for these last two questions here. Yeah.
You talked a little bit earlier about how sort of beauty and truth are very connected in art.
Yeah.
And also about how, sort of in Aquinas' account, beauty is very fundamental to reality. But then also how in Flannery's work, she often uses the grotesque or like sort of the opposite of beauty to
The ugly.
communicate, the ugly to communicate reality or to like break through our unrealities.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of wondering how those like kind of seemingly opposed ideas can interact.
Yeah, so I think it's like about the dramatic action of the story and where the arc of the story is going. So lots of ugly things in A Good Man is hard to find because children get murdered and it's bad. But at the same time, there is a moment of grace that is beautiful. And there's also a kind of redemptive arc to the whole thing, which is also beautiful. And so I think it's about recognizing that the ugliness that is there is in some sense necessary to the beauty that's also there, right? And I think that this does point to the reality of grace, right? Like, why do we need grace? Because there's something ugly in us. Grace is beautiful, right? But it's addressing something that is broken. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very grateful for this event, and thank you so much. I'm a little reluctant to ask this question, but I'm a little sorry to be the last one to end, but just seemed fitting. I'm a pastor in Minneapolis, and I just wondered if you could maybe speak to how the experience that we've had here in Minneapolis in recent months, just last month, I guess in August, at Annunciation School and Parish, just how Flannery really speaks and maybe brings some light into that. And I've certainly been walking with my people, and I'm aware that all of us are living that experience, but I think the fittingness of you being here to invite us into Flannery's vision really does open a door and a pathway, and just wondered if there was any comment that you might offer, because I do think that there's more connectivity than might immediately be present in the gruesomeness of what was experienced, and how Flannery might invite a path forward.
Yeah, that's tough. That was really tough for me. I think it was really tough for most Catholics, but I think the thing that really got me about all that is that, Catholic schools kind of all more or less operate in the same way. And of course, my children were in Mass at the exact same time, hearing the exact same psalm. So that one was tough. Obviously, any brutal murder of children is tough, but that one was extra tough. And I think, the only thing that you can say in the face of evil, of that kind of magnitude, is that, the truth is that every bad thing that happens in this world is part of God's providential order. That is a basic commitment of our faith. And that is hard. But I think that Flannery is especially attuned to that reality, that every suffering that we have is potentially redemptive for all of us. Which isn't to say, there are all kinds of things that just don't follow from that, right? One thing that doesn't follow from that is that God wants small children murdered at Mass. He does not want that. But nevertheless, in his permitting that to happen, which he clearly does, there has to be a redemptive arc to that as much as to anything. And that for us as Catholics, but for us as Americans, we have to think about how we take that reality, which is very difficult, and help use it as a way for us to grow as a church and grow as a people of God, because we have no choice but to do that. That's what we're called to do. People lose their faith all the time when bad things happen. It's the most common thing. But it's sad, it's a tragedy, because it's when you're suffering that you need your faith the most. It's when you're suffering that your faith is most meaningful and real and necessary, and it's the only thing that can make your suffering not meaningless, right? Flannery understands that our suffering is not meaningless. And, that doesn't make our suffering something that we enjoy or like or want. But it's not meaningless, and it has a redemptive arc. That's what I would say. But it's hard. I think Flannery has a quote where she says, "Evil is not a problem that can be solved, but a mystery to be endured." And I think that's probably pretty wise.
Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us. Yeah, let's thank her again. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us in this setting, but also all day and tomorrow over at Catholic Studies as well. It's been a gift, so thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'm going to invite Dr. Derek Halverson, who is our advancement director at Anselm House, up to close out the night. But as I do so, let me just remind you, please fill out the evaluation cards and do drop those in one of the baskets on your way out. So here's Derek. He's going to announce our book giveaway winners, as well as some other invitations.
I am. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. We really are grateful to have you with us. I wanted to make folks aware, before I announce the winners, of a couple upcoming events. I think we have slides for these. But on October 30th, we'll be hosting a business lecture featuring Elaine Howard Eklund of Rice University. She'll be speaking on religion and a changing workplace, so please add that to your calendar. And on November 11th, we'll be hosting John Hendricks for a gallery night and lecture. John is a New York Times best-selling author and illustrator, professor at Washington University in St. Louis, so please do try to make it out for those two events. I also wanted to mention that events like this and like these upcoming lectures are made possible by the generosity of our partners, for whom we are deeply grateful. If you are interested in partnering with Anselm House or with Catholic Studies at St. Thomas, we would be grateful if you would take advantage of these QR codes. You could even scan them surreptitiously or discreetly right now, or in a very obvious way to put pressure on your neighbors to also participate. You can always also speak with one of us. As Andrew mentioned, we do have 3 winners of Flannery O'Connor short story collection books. You can pick these up at the welcome table out in the lobby. Those 3 folks are Reese Gorney, Stephanie Williams, and Anna Zoller. So Reese, Stephanie, and Anna, please stop by the table on your way out and grab those books. Finally, as Andrew mentioned before the lecture this evening, we will have a reception out in the lobby afterwards. Please join us and continue the conversation. Thank you for being here this evening, and as we depart, we pray that God's blessing would go with you, and we'd ask that you once more thank Professor Jennifer Frey.